Hey, what's good? So this is my book review for Unforgivable Blackness: The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson by Jeffrey C. Ward. This is a very good book, man. It's about 450 pages. Pretty much entertaining throughout. It doesn't just provide Jack Johnson's life, but it provides mini bios for many fighters at the time that fought as well, like mini bios just to give you the idea at that time, like John L. Sullivan, Jim Corbett, Bob Fitzsimmons, Sam Langford, a little bit of Sam Langford, um, Joe Jeanette, Joe Walcott. He actually trained with Joe Walcott back in the day. You know, when he was just getting into boxing, he was training with Barbados Joe Walcott, who's a bad man, as well as Jack Johnson. They gave many biographies of Peter Jackson, who is also a black heavyweight before Jack Johnson's time, that they did not give him a shot. And many believe that Peter Jackson would have beaten John L. Sullivan had he not refused to fight a heavyweight at that time. Most of the newspapers and the books at that time wrote that John L. Sullivan was afraid of that he'll lose to Peter Jackson. So he died with never getting his title shot. So in a way, Jack Johnson redeemed, and he fought for all those people, all those black fighters that never got that shot in his life. Jack Johnson is from Galveston, Texas, which is like an island peninsula type deal, which he says in his book that made him think of himself as just Jack Johnson, that people didn't really draw a colored line where he was from, like blacks hanging around with white kids and white kids hanging around with black people like all the time. So that's why he said he was inherently a real American. So the black people weren't viewed as being American, they were viewed as Negro back then, right? But Jack Johnson viewed himself as an American, as inherently American, as only Jack Johnson, not as a Negro trying to get, rights, or trying to get into trying to get into the society to agree with what he says. He did what he wanted because part of that is his upbringing in that little town, or that little town, that little island of Galveston. I forget what it's called, or I don't know how it's pronounced, but Jack Johnson views himself as just being a man, not as black, not as white, but as a man who does whatever he wants. There's a funny story in the beginning how Jack Johnson got into his first fight. So there was a kid who would always bully him. And this review will be pretty long, so bear with me, please. There was a kid who would always bully him and hit him for no reason. And one time, this kid was bullying him. He took something from him. And there was this lady across the street, some old lady, an old white woman that all the neighborhood respected. And she saw this kid was bullying Jack, and she's like, "Man, if you don't whoop him, I'll go out there and whoop you." So Jack Johnson was so scared of what was gonna happen, of this white old woman that said he was gonna beat him up, that he actually got in a fight with this guy and he knocked him out. He's like, "Oh, okay, maybe I could fight." And Jack Johnson was like a busy kid, a vagabond, you could say. He was never home. He would leave, go on train rides as a hobo. In one ride as a hobo, he was sleeping on hay, and the security came in. He's like, "If you don't got a ticket, you gotta get the fuck out. You gotta jump." He's like, "Oh, I ain't jumping. The train's moving too fast." So this guy throws a left hook. Jack Johnson ducks under, hits him with an uppercut, knocks him clean out. Knocks him out. And before he wakes up, he jumps out the window when the train was about to slow down. a bunch of tall tales like this. Jack Johnson is a character, man. Before he was champion, he they knew he was gonna be a great fighter. Jack Johnson was flamboyant. He could speak. Jack Johnson would go into the ring. First fighter that would go into the ring with his bathrobe all flashy. He'd go into the ring with his pink trunks. The white crowd hated him. They hated Jack Johnson, man. There was there's gonna be a lot of parallels with a lot of fighters that come after Jack Johnson. A lot of parallels. They learned from him, and they didn't learn from him from his failures. But like a lot of heavyweights like Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali and Floyd Mayweather, I am sure have taken note from Jack Johnson. I know for a fact Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali have, because they respect their history. So there was this moment where he was fighting someone, and he gave an envelope to someone at ringside, and he's like, "What's this?" He's like, "Open it after the fight." He's like, he knocked this guy out the fifth round. He's like, "Open that letter now." So that guy opened the letter. It said KO 5. He predicted the rounds. Who does that sound like? Someone that calls himself the greatest, who picked the rounds as well. So he was flamboyant. He was making money. He bought once he became champion. He bought a car when there was only like 100,000 cars in existence in the United States. He bought himself a car. Would go down speeding. He he chased around Jeffries, James Jeffries. He chased him around all through the world, and he's like, I'm never gonna fight a colored heavyweight ever. So Jack Johnson kept following him, but he didn't want to fight him. He's like, I'll retire. I'll first retire before I fight Jack Johnson. So he did retire, and he's like, yeah, you two fight, whatever. It was Marvin Hart and someone else. Marvin Hart won. Marvin Hart, who had beaten Jack Johnson before. Actually, he's like, come on, fight me. So Marvin Hart wouldn't want to fight him, but he fought Tommy Burns. And Tommy Burns was a heavyweight champion. So he chased Tommy Burns all around Europe, all around Australia, all around the United States. He did not want to fight him. It was not until a promoter, Hugh McIntosh, put up the money that Tommy Burns actually wanted. Tommy Burns wanted $30,000 to fight Jack Johnson. And at that time, that was like, dude, you're not going to get 30 grand to fight Jackie Johnson, man. You're not. So no one was offering him 30 grand, so he wasn't going to fight Jack Johnson. So he kept chasing him around the world, man. Around the world for a heavyweight title fight, because this man was too scared. Just like Jeffries was too afraid to fight him. And eventually this promoter came about. His name was Hugh McIntosh. And he came out, and he got a bunch of millionaires together. He's like, come on, just offer him his 30 grand. He could get it. And so he gave Tommy Burns 30 grand. Jack Johnson got some chump change, like $5,000. And this fight took place in Australia, a place that had once welcomed him before, because Australia was not the United States, which was full of racial tension. They actually loved a bunch of black fighters like Sam Langford and Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh that were welcome in Australia, as well as other places like in Europe and Cuba, that they were welcome to fight there, a black fighter. But once it was for the heavyweight championship of the world, it was like, I don't want it's not the same as riding WRITE. That, excuse me. It's not the same as going for this guy who's winning the colored heavyweight championship of the world. And I say like Negro because that was the word used at the time, but it wasn't the same as rooting for this man that was winning these fights against other black fighters, or just beating white opponents who weren't heavyweight champion. It was different if this guy was going to represent the world as the world heavyweight champion of the world. Because what the heavyweight championship meant at the time, man, it was like you were as famous as the president. Everybody, you would go to saloons or offices when John L. Sullivan was champion, and they would have pictures of the president and the heavyweight champion. That's how much the champion meant at the time. And they're like, oh, I don't want Jack Johnson to win. But Tommy Burns got his money. They booed the hell out of him. But Jack Johnson beat him up, man. And he was rowdy. He was talking crap to everybody at ringside who were trying to boo him. Kill the nigger, and saying all types of stuff like that, man. A bunch of racial slurs. And he knocked he knocked Tommy Burns out, who was essentially a middleweight anyway. But he knocked this fool out. He became the heavyweight champion of the world, and he went back to Chicago, where he had adopted it as his hometown. All black neighborhoods around the country, in Baltimore, in Chicago, in New York, in Harlem, right? They all celebrated. They had rallies, but there was also a bunch of racial hate. Bunch of race riots occurred. Even more so when he kept beating up his contenders. One of the greatest knockouts of all time was when he fought Stanley Ketchel, and Stanley Ketchel had actually knocked him down. And once he got up, Stanley Ketchel, excuse me, Stanley Ketchel went over there to go for his knockout. He hits him with a solid right hand that actually he hits him so hard that Jack Johnson goes flying too. Like he falls too. That's how much force he hit Stanley Ketchel with. But they're like, dude, there's no white fighter that could beat him. They were just finding a great white hope to beat him. Because this guy was coming out, he's being flamboyant, racing his cars, buying $1,000 suits. And we got to understand, this was a time that the money is worth a lot more. Back then, he was buying $1,000 suits, buying cars, speeding on the roads. He would get fined all the time. Cops would pull him over for no reason. He would have to pay. There was one time he got stopped for speeding. And then the cops like, $500, or it was like $250, and he gave him $500, and he's like, I don't got change. Jack Johnson said, man, keep it, cause I'm about to blow this one too. It was just a flashy, arrogant, flamboyant man, as like I've been saying before. But that's why white America hated him, and they wanted to bring up a white hope that would be him. So they're like, James J. Jeffries, come out of retirement, please. We need you, man. We need you to beat this darky. That's what they would say. We need you to beat this darky who's running rampant, with our white women and beating up white contenders, acting like he's somebody. We need someone that'll humble him. James Jeffries came out. He's like, I don't want to. He asked for 30 grand too. So that's what happened. And they fought. They actually built a stadium in San Francisco, but then that fight couldn't be made because of political problems. So they made the fight in Reno, which was New Mexico at that time. No, never mind. Las Vegas was Mexico back then. That was another fight. This fight took place in Reno. And Jack Johnson whooped Jeffries. He whooped him, and Jim Corbett was in Jeffries' corner trying to root for him and heckling Jack Johnson, and Jack Johnson would heckle back while they were fighting. This man was so talented. He's one of the strongest, heaviest punches, fastest, best defensive fighters that have ever lived. They say that Jack Johnson would just lean back. You know how you're supposed to move to the sides to block a punch? He would just lean back. And they say that leaning back while trying to block a punch or trying to dodge a punch is like trying to move straight back from a moving train. But Jack Johnson has done that, and Muhammad Ali has done that. He said that Jack Johnson and Muhammad Ali are the only men that they know that could do that have the defensive skills. So this is where Muhammad Ali gets it from. Flamboyance, his talkative skills, from Jack Johnson. He was the first. And then he went after beating Jeffries. Yeah, I beat Jeffries. All the colored people in the world, in the United States, the black people, celebrated. The one man called him the greatest colored man that ever lived. And back then he might have been, like they might have believed that he was on top of the world. But then they just could not let him. They could not let him live with himself, right? They just could not let him be as a successful black man who does what he wants, who smiles in the ring, who has a golden smile, man. They just could not let him be. This is when all these lawsuits came in. A lot of equivalent to Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson loved this woman, and he got in trouble because of them. So did Jack Johnson. At that time, they put in a something called the Mann Act. The Mann Act was that it was supposed to be to prevent unmoral conduct. So basically, prostitution. So you could not transport women across state lines for the purpose of immoral acts, which was basically prostitutions. And they didn't really, how do you say it? They didn't really put this into action that much. Like, they didn't really catch that many people, under the constructs of the Mann Act breaking the law. But they caught Jack Johnson because he always had like 2-3 women at a time. He got married after a while, but they tried to get him for this, and they really had nothing on him. They're like, this woman was white, and he's like, dude, I didn't get it. That was before the Mann Act was intact, and his life, but he had to pay a lot of money to get these lawyers, to get these attorneys, to get to just to stay free. And this was a time that he was messing around with a lot of women, and he got married, and he was with his wife for a while, but his wife just became very schizophrenic, kind of. She tried to jump off bridges, tried to jump off the buildings, try to kill herself all the time, try to poison herself. He kind of had to hire security, like 2-3 women, just so she wouldn't kill herself. But eventually, she killed herself in the saloon that he owned on the second floor, which was where they lived. She killed herself. A very sad day for Jack Johnson. Very sad day in his life. It's like, man, I lost the love of my life. This was just one of the tragedies that happened to Jack Johnson. After that, this chick that he was with, that he actually paid her to start her own business because he had a lot of money. He was the first fighter to earn $120,000 from, what fight was it? I think he took over 120 grand from that Jeffries fight, actually. So he was rolling in dough. But they could not let this man live his life like that. You cannot let this flamboyant black man live successfully. So they had to get him. So this one hoe he was with, she was a hoe. But that's kind of people that Jack Johnson would hang out with, burnouts, hoes and pimps. People he liked. It was a district called the Black Belt in Chicago where he owned a saloon, and he would just hang out with people, chill with the women, drink, just chill. But there was this chick that she said that he transported her through state lines after the Mann Act had been in place. And no matter how many lawyers or attorneys and how much money, they basically took all his money. The heavyweight champion of the world, they took all his money just so he could keep his freedom. And they couldn't win. He was very confident. He's like, man, you could buy your freedom, but he couldn't. He just could not. And he was sentenced to a year and 1 day. Instead, he fled. He fled to Canada, Montreal, and then he fled to Europe with his new wife, which he got married to like a few months after his wife had committed suicide. So he fled to Canada from Chicago in his car. with his wife and his promoter, and then they went to Europe. They fought in Europe. They fought in Europe for a while, but then it was like time of World War I. This book goes into depth of all of that. It was World War I time. He was chilling in Germany, and they were dropping bombs in Britain and all that. So he's like, it's not. It wasn't really safe for him in those parts of the world, anyways. And plus, he was kind of getting a bad rep because he was a refugee in 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 those lands at the time. He was not a refugee, a fugitive. He was a fugitive from his own homeland, and he's like, man, I miss my home. And at the time, he was losing money because he would have to go do exhibitions and sparrings, and he even ended up doing circus shows, just asking people like, "What do you want to ask me?" You know, in the circus, like a literal circus. So this man went. He went from Britain, and he's like, I gotta go, man. So they made him leave Europe, and then he's like, I'm gonna go to South America where I'm gonna fight Jess Willard, who Jess Willard many refer to as like a bum that Jack Johnson was gonna be easy. He was just too skillful, too strong, too fast. But he was not allowed to go to Mexico because they said if they caught him in Mexico, they were gonna send him to the United States. So he just chilled in Havana, and he's like, let's just make the fight here. And what's interesting is that the people weren't rooting for Jack Johnson; they were rooting for Jess Willard. And you know a little bit about Cuba. You know that a lot of they have a big African or black population in Cuba, but Jess Willard was the one that was the popular one. 37-year-old Jack Johnson, accused of taking a fall. He lost in the 26 rounds. It was 105 degrees that day. He lost the heavyweight championship of the world that day. He just could not knock this big 6'6", 240-pound dude out. It was past his time. He later said that he fixed the fight because he needed the money, which he did. But I do not believe that he fixed the fight, nor was there like too much evidence to suggest that he fixed the fight. So then he had to move from Cuba because he himself had said that he fixed the fight. So they made him leave. He's like, crap. So he moved to Tijuana where he fought a bunch of fights, and he was very popular in Mexico. That's actually where he was popular. In Mexico, they loved him over there. He made boxing a little bit more popular at that time. I'm doing all this from memory, so it's from all the important parts that I remember. There's a lot more information, a lot more jewels, a lot more gems in this book. I suggest you read it. But yeah, so he's living in Mexico, and he's like, I want to leave, but they made him leave anyway. So he was living in Tijuana. He was living in Tijuana, which is now it's a party town. So it was a party town then. He loved it. He loved where the party's at. He loved where chilling with women. And then he moved. He's like, okay. So he tried to strike a deal, tried to get a pardon, but he could not. So the moment he stepped into U.S. soil, he got arrested and sent to jail to serve his time. Interesting thing is that he's like, my time in prison wasn't that bad. He says that they treated him all right, and he was able to do his thing in prison, kind of serve as a security in a way. He wasn't a snitch, but he had it well. He didn't suffer too long. After 10 months, they allowed him to get his freedom for good behavior. And at that time, there was another young heavyweight, Jack Dempsey, who got the title shot against Jess Willard. And Jess Willard had only defended his title once against I don't even remember who it was, some insignificant rival. And then he's like, man, I'm going to fight one more time, and then I'm going to fight Jack Johnson, and I'm going to let him get a rematch. But he went into the wrong man in Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey went in, broke his jaw, broke his ribs, broke like 4 ribs, shattered his jaw. And he became the new champion. Jack Johnson, he's like, come on, I want to fight Jack Dempsey when he got out. And Jack Dempsey's like, you're black. So they drew the color line again, and they never gave Jack Johnson a chance. This time, that's when Dempsey beat Jack Johnson, and Jack Johnson had to struggle. Man, he fought. He was fighting until he was like 60, 65. He fought like fighting in actual fights. He had to go do exhibitions, had to ask people for money, and it was just from what he from what he was to what he became. It was just a fall. It was a excellent rise to the pinnacle of the world, to the depths of the ocean, man. How far he fell. He had to do it. Circus shows, like I said, having kids like punch him, and he had to like dodge him and punch him in the stomach and all that, just to make some money. Just to make some money. That's what all the stuff he had to do. His wife divorced him. He They took away his saloon. They still kept finding him, and he was broke. He was broke at the age of 66. I think he did an exhibition with Joe Jeanette, who was like 63 as well, and it was just sad. Then came out Joe Louis, who was like a humble black fighter who wouldn't talk, who would just do all the talking in the ring, who just quiet all the time. And they portrayed him as the anti Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson hated this. Jack Johnson wanted to train him, but one of his hated rivals, Jack Blackburn, a man that he hated, that he actually had beef with from back in the day, like from 1908, trained Jack Johnson, so trained Joe Louis. So he tried to get a piece of Joe Louis because he knew Joe Louis was very talented. So when Joe Louis didn't want to be trained by Jack Johnson just turns the other head and just keeps talking about Joe Louis. He's like, oh, he's gonna lose. He sucks. His footwork, his stance is just horrible. And Jack Johnson actually predicted that Max Schmeling was gonna knock out Jack Johnson in their first encounter. But he was the only ex heavyweight champion of the world who picked Schmeling against Joe Louis, the second fight they had, the fight, right? But Jack Johnson was just hated even more now that Joe Louis was there. They're like, don't be like Jack Johnson. Don't be a bad black fighter. Be a good one, a humble one. So Jack Johnson was even more hated then because of Joe, like in part because of Joe Louis, how much people loved Joe Louis. And that even enraged Jack Johnson even more at that time, man. So at the time of his death, man, he it was tragic. He went into a restaurant with one of his friends. He was an old man already, 60, in his mid 60s. He went into this restaurant, and they're like, "We'll serve you, but you gotta eat in the back." So they ate because they were extremely hungry. But Jack Johnson went out. He was pissed. He's like, "Let me drive," and then he drove. He turned in the corner way too quick because he drove fast, like his life fast. That's how he lived. Crashed into he swerved because he was about to crash into his truck. Crashed into a telephone pole. Died on impact. Man, this way he died, and just how he lived his life at the time he died was just tragic, man. It's a tragic life filled with glory, filled with women, money, but came to a tragic end. He died, broke, old, and tragically. It's a sad, sad life. How far a man could come and how far he could fall. Yeah, rest in peace. Rest in peace, Jack Johnson. I truly believe Jack Johnson is one of the greatest fighters that had ever lived, and at least, if anything else, like a top 5 heavyweight champion of the world. Anyway, thanks for watching. This is a really long video, but I had to give this book a little justice by talking about what was inside of it. If you're still watching, thank you so much. I really, really recommend reading this book. It took me a while. It's like 450 pages. I'm a little bit of a slow reader. If you're a faster reader, you'll probably finish it in a few weeks because it is a very good book. It also has like some hidden words like under where you have the index. You know what I'm talking about, where where it has like the little number and then the words at the bottom. It has a lot of information. So read all the information in this book. It has a lot of extra information that you has a lot of information that you will not want to skip, because it's a lot of good information about his life and about that particular story and about other stories. Like it had I told you about how his first fight, it says that that's pretty much how Sugar Ray Robinson got in his first fight too. Like someone made him get into a fight because, or else he was gonna whoop him. That was Sugar Ray Robinson. When it was like Jack Johnson Jack Johnson got these fancy cars so they would know it's him. It said how Sugar Ray Robinson got his own like pink Cadillac so people know it was him, so they could identify it was him. So at the end, Johnson was a guy that loved attention, that loved to fight, that built his own legacy. And it is a shame that we don't mention Jack Johnson as much. What we do, we just mention, of course, that he is the first black heavyweight champion of the world. And yes, that is a great feat, but he was also a great fighter with unmatched skill at the time. At the time, he was at the time, he was the greatest fighter that had ever lived. Bar none, he was the greatest fighter that ever lived at that time. At least top 10 now, in my opinion, of all time. Of all time. So, in the end, very good book. Very recommended. Sold me on Jack Johnson. I knew very little about his life and his career, but this guy lived a fast-paced life, and he died the way he lived. So, yeah, pick this book up. I picked it up in my library. You could check in yours. Very worth the read. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you're still watching, thank you so much. Please leave your comment below and subscribe. Peace.